In the early 1950s, Ernesto Guevara was not a revolutionary figure, nor was he searching for one. He was a medical student from Argentina, trained to observe symptoms, diagnose illnesses, and treat individuals. His worldview at the time was structured, rational, and largely apolitical. He believed in education, science, and gradual improvement. When he left Argentina to travel across Latin America, the journey was not meant to change him. It was meant to complete him. The plan was simple: travel the continent, gain experience, see the realities of life beyond the classroom, then return home and finish his medical training. There was no ideology attached to the trip, no intention of challenging systems or questioning power. Ernesto Guevara left believing that suffering was primarily a medical problem. What he encountered would challenge that belief at every step. As he moved through Chile, Peru, Colombia, and other parts of the continent, the conditions he witnessed followed a disturbingly familiar pattern. In mining towns, workers showed the same symptoms of exhaustion and lung disease regardless of nationality. In rural villages, families lacked access to even the most basic medical care. Children died from treatable illnesses. Entire communities lived beside valuable resources without ever benefiting from them. At first, Ernesto responded as he had been trained to. He treated patients when possible. He recorded observations. He documented conditions. But the more distance he traveled, the harder it became to ignore what connected these places. Different governments, different cultures, different languages. Yet the same outcomes repeated themselves with near precision. This repetition unsettled him. The suffering he observed did not appear accidental. It was not isolated. And it was not temporary. It was persistent, predictable, and deeply embedded in everyday life. Ernesto began to notice that the explanations offered for this suffering varied widely, while the results never did. Responsibility was always placed somewhere else. On geography, on culture, on individual failure. But the structure producing the outcome remained invisible. As the journey continued, Ernesto's focus shifted. He began paying less attention to individual cases and more attention to patterns. Who owned the land? Who controlled labor? Who benefited from production? These were not questions medicine had prepared him to ask. Yet they emerged naturally from what he was seeing on the ground. By the time he reached Peru and encountered leper colonies and marginalized indigenous communities, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Medicine could ease pain, could save lives, but it could not address the forces that made suffering inevitable for entire populations. Treating patients felt increasingly like addressing symptoms while leaving the disease untouched. This realization did not radicalize him overnight. It did something quieter and more dangerous. Created doubt. Doubt in neutrality. Doubt in gradual reform. Doubt in the idea that professional expertise alone could resolve structural harm. Ernesto Guevara did not abandon medicine on this journey, but he began to understand its limits. When the trip finally ended, Ernesto returned with the same credentials he had left with. He was still a medical graduate, still technically the same person, but his understanding of the world had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. He had seen too much consistency in suffering to believe it was random, too much repetition to believe it was accidental. This journey did not make him famous. It did not make him dangerous. But it changed the questions he would ask for the rest of his life. And those questions would eventually lead him far beyond medicine. When Ernesto Guevara returned from his journey across Latin America, the questions that followed him did not fade with time. They sharpened. The experiences he had witnessed on the road began to reframe how he interpreted events beyond medicine. What once appeared as isolated hardship now looked like a repeating structure. And structure, he understood, was never accidental. He continued his medical path, but his attention increasingly drifted toward politics, economics, and history. He read extensively, not as an activist, but as someone trying to understand why the same suffering appeared in different countries under different governments. The answer, he began to suspect, was not local failure. It was systemic design. This suspicion deepened when Ernesto traveled to Guatemala in the mid-1950s. At the time, Guatemala was attempting something rare in the region: reform. A democratically elected government was pushing for land redistribution, labor protections, and national control over resources. On paper, it was peaceful change through legal means. To Ernesto, it appeared to confirm that reform was possible. What followed shattered that belief. Foreign economic interests, threatened by these reforms, applied pressure. Political destabilization followed. Then intervention. The government collapsed rapidly, not because it lacked popular support, but because it challenged power beyond its borders. Ernesto witnessed how quickly legality dissolved when it conflicted with entrenched interests. Reform was not debated. It was removed. This moment marked a turning point. For the first time, Ernesto saw peaceful change not merely fail, but be actively dismantled. The speed and efficiency of the collapse left a lasting impression. It was not chaos. It was controlled. And that control exposed a reality he could no longer ignore. Systems of power defended themselves with force when necessary. From Guatemala onward, Ernesto's thinking became more rigid, more disciplined. He did not become reckless. He became deliberate. Neutrality began to feel dishonest. Observation without action began to resemble complicity. The idea that one could exist outside the system and still benefit from it no longer made sense to him. It was during this period that Ernesto began encountering others who shared similar conclusions. Exiles, political refugees, survivors of failed reforms. Their stories differed in detail but not in outcome. Peaceful change had limits, and those limits were enforced. When Ernesto arrived in Mexico, these ideas found a direction. There, he met individuals who were no longer discussing reform, but planning confrontation. Among them were Cuban exiles preparing to challenge a dictatorship they believed could not be removed through elections. Their discussions were not emotional. They were strategic, focused, grounded in the belief that power would not surrender voluntarily. Ernesto listened closely. He did not present himself as a leader. He did not claim certainty. But when he spoke, it was clear that his experiences had aligned with their conclusions. Violence, in his view, was not a desire. It was a consequence, a response to systems that had already demonstrated their willingness to use force. This was the phase where Ernesto Guevara stopped seeing revolution as theory and began seeing it as logistics. Training replaced discussion. Preparation replaced speculation. His medical knowledge, once focused solely on healing, now extended to endurance, survival, and battlefield reality. He had not yet become Che Guevara, but he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Medicine had shown him suffering. Guatemala had shown him its source, and Mexico would show him the path forward. By the time the Cuban Revolution succeeded, Ernesto Guevara had already shed much of the uncertainty that defined his earlier years. The struggle had validated his conclusions. A government had fallen not through negotiation or reform, but through organized confrontation. To Ernesto, this was confirmation rather than victory. Power had responded exactly as he believed it would. With the revolution complete, Ernesto found himself in an unfamiliar position. He was no longer an observer or a participant operating on the margins. He was now part of the new authority. Given responsibilities within the revolutionary government, he was tasked with enforcing discipline, overseeing institutions, and protecting what had been won. These roles required decisiveness, not doubt. He approached governance with the same rigidity that had defined his revolutionary thinking. Order had to be maintained. Opposition had to be neutralized. Hesitation, he believed, would invite collapse. To Ernesto, these were not acts of cruelty, but of necessity. The revolution, in his view, could not afford ambiguity. Yet governing exposed a new contradiction. The structures he now managed required compromise. Bureaucracy replaced movement. Administration replaced momentum. Meetings replaced action. Ernesto grew increasingly restless within these confines. He had fought to dismantle systems, not to maintain them. Power, once seized, demanded stability. And stability felt dangerously close to stagnation. Outside Cuba, Ernesto's image began to spread. Photographs circulated internationally. His face became recognizable, then symbolic. The world began compressing his identity into an icon while he was still alive. This process unsettled him deeply. He had not acted to be admired. He had acted because he believed circumstances demanded it. As his public image expanded, his private dissatisfaction grew. Ernesto began to view Cuba not as a destination, but as a precedent. The revolution, in his mind, was incomplete if it remained confined to one country. Injustice persisted elsewhere, and therefore so must resistance. He gradually withdrew from formal roles, relinquishing titles and responsibilities with little sentimentality. Power, once achieved, held little appeal for him. What mattered was continuation, expansion, momentum. He believed that revolution, if allowed to rest, would decay. This belief carried him beyond Cuba, first toward Africa and later back toward South America. But the environment he entered was no longer favorable. Governments had learned from earlier upheavals. Intelligence agencies monitored movements closely. Support networks were weaker. Local conditions differed sharply from Cuba. Ernesto found himself increasingly isolated. Despite this, he pressed forward. Not because success was assured, but because retreat felt incompatible with the logic he had built his life around. To question the path now would have meant questioning every sacrifice made before it. By the time he arrived in Bolivia, the limitations of his strategy were becoming clear. Local support was fragmented. Communication was unreliable. Resources were scarce. One by one, his companions were lost through capture, desertion, or death. Ernesto understood the situation fully, and still he chose to remain. This was not martyrdom. It was consistency. He had followed his conclusions to their furthest point. And at this stage, survival itself felt like compromise. On October 9, 1967, Ernesto Guevara was executed in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, Bolivia. There was no trial, no public statement, and no attempt to turn the moment into spectacle. The decision had already been made. Quietly, efficiently, the man who had spent years confronting power was removed without ceremony. He was 39 years old. In the hours before his execution, there is no credible evidence that Ernesto attempted to reshape how he would be remembered. Witnesses later described him as calm and composed. He did not plead for survival. He did not attempt to negotiate. By this point, the outcome did not surprise him. He had accepted the risk long before Bolivia. Death changed everything. Almost immediately, Ernesto Guevara ceased to be treated as a historical figure and became a symbol. His image detached from context. His choices were simplified. Supporters emphasized his ideals and ignored his brutality. Critics emphasized his violence and ignored the forces that shaped him. Both versions reduced a complex life into something easier to consume. But the truth sits somewhere in between. The most unsettling aspect of Ernesto Guevara's story is not the actions he took, but how logical they appeared to him at each stage. He did not begin with hatred. He began with empathy. He did not seek conflict for its own sake. He arrived at it after repeated exposure to systems that resisted peaceful change. This is why the man before the revolution matters. Before the icon, there was a medical student trying to treat suffering. Before the certainty, there was a traveler observing patterns. Before the rifle, there was a belief that knowledge and care could repair the world. When that belief failed, it was replaced not by madness but by conviction. History continues to debate whether Ernesto Guevara should be remembered as a hero or a villain. That debate often misses something essential. He was neither myth nor monster. He was a man shaped by what he witnessed and by how he chose to respond to it. The real warning in his story is not about revolution itself. It is about certainty, about how moral conviction, once freed from doubt, can justify almost anything. How empathy, when paired with absolute belief, can transform into permission. Understanding Ernesto Guevara does not require admiration or condemnation. It requires honesty about systems, about choices, and about how easily a desire to heal the world can become a willingness to destroy it in order to rebuild. That is the story behind the legend. And that is why it still matters.